Welcome to the Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder. My name is Jacob Cooper. I'm the best-selling author of Life After Breath, a near-death experiencer. For those spiritual seekers who are new to my channel, we love having you here. Please make sure to hit that subscribe button as well as bell notification icon to get up-to-date information on my weekly podcast. Those of you who have been here before, we love having you here. Today's guest is Heather Tesch. Heather Tesch is the host of Beyond with Heather Tesch, a wonderful podcast which I was recently on, but she's also a former meteorologist for the Weather Channel, as well as someone who has a rich journalistic background. So Heather's going to share her transformation from covering the Weather Channel and traditional journalism to now a different type of spiritual journalism that she's utilizing in her own wonderful podcast. You don't want to miss our wonderful conversation. So stay tuned for a wonderful conversation with Heather Tesch. Heather Tesch, welcome
Hello.
to my channel, The Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder. Pleasure having you. I was a guest. I was honored to be on your guest, Beyond with Heather Tesch, and now you're coming on mine. So tell the viewers a little bit about your journey, because to me it's fascinating. I know you're working up at the high levels of the Weather Channel, meteorology, and now we're talking about other different stratospheres here with the afterlife. But so tell us a little bit about your podcast and some of how you shifted from, working, in mass media on the Weather Channel to now, interviewing people like myself, talking about near-death experiences. I find it fascinating, the transformation that you have had.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. It's my honor to be here. And it was so fun to have you on my podcast as well. But it is kind of a strange transition. And I think it's still something that some of the people that are used to seeing me on the Weather Channel as a meteorologist, as scientists are kind of going, what are you doing now? This woo-woo stuff. But the truth is I was always fascinated by near-death experiences and fascinated, just by the big questions in life, what is it all about? And so I was always reading these stories on the side. And once, YouTube came along, listening to these stories, and I've always been fascinating. But in my work life, I initially was a journalist, went to journalism school at the University of Minnesota. Then I decided, it seems really interesting what these meteorologists are doing that I work with. So I went back to school and got a degree in meteorology. And I worked at several different television stations, either as a reporter or as a meteorologist. And that's because my husband was in the Navy at the time. So he moved around a lot, which gave me the opportunity to work in several areas. And then when he got out of the Navy, we went back to Minneapolis. I worked there. And then the Weather Channel called and said, hey, would you like to come down and talk to us? And I thought, oh, I'll check it out. But I didn't think I'd leave Minnesota. That's where I'm from. That's where my husband's from. And I met everybody there. They were wonderful. It's beautiful here in Georgia. Everything was so green and sunny. So I've been down here in Atlanta, the Atlanta area now, for 24 years and just loving it. And just recently started this podcast. So in May, I wrapped up my work as a meteorologist. And 2 days later, my podcast came on the air. And I've been doing 2 episodes a week ever since.
Yes, Tuesdays and Thursdays, right? Is that correct? They're out. So
correct.
Viewers, do check out her podcast. There's, it's really exploding right now, and she has a lot of wonderful guests, and she's a great interviewer. But I wanted to ask you, because this seems like this was budding for a while, you said. Like, where did you first start to hear about near-death experiences? Like, did you read a book? Did you, read Raymond's book? Like, how did that come to you?
I believe my first book was Betty Eadie's book, and I was fascinated by it. And then I wanted more, and I read Daniel Brinkley's book. And at that time, it was hard to find these stories. A book would come out maybe every couple of years or every few years. So I would just kind of eat them up. But then, when the internet came along, when YouTube came along, suddenly you could listen to all of these stories. There was also IONs where you could find all these stories, written accounts. And so I think I've read thousands and thousands and listened to probably thousands as well. And I just really can't get enough. I just find them so fascinating. And now it's so awesome to, talk to people like you and other people that have actually had near-death experiences, because I can see how genuine you are, and you just know it's so believable. And so that's really been a blessing for me, and I think for the audience as well, everybody that's tuning in right now and able to hear your story and other stories.
Yeah, I mean, certainly in the 90s, near-death experiences started to hit the mass media. I know Oprah was a big
Yes.
champion of allowing Betty to come on her program. I think that really increased it. But these things have been around for thousands of years. They're nothing new. But now you're seeing an entire explosion where we have channels like myself and yourself and Netflix, and they made like a movie that just came out. Why would you say more people are being drawn to near death experiences? And what's the reason that people gravitate to hear near death experiences? What do you feel they've brought to you and so many people who are tuning into these encounters? Seems like at a heightened basis these days.
Well, that's a great question. And I think it's also one that's hard to answer, because you can look at it philosophically and say, okay, was this all meant to be? Are these some of the changes we're going through, and mankind is going to be evolving through hearing more of these stories? Or is it that people are just craving it? There's so much division out there. And I think some people are just craving kindness. And in addition to, just being fascinated by near-death experiences, I love how they transform people. And they transform people who have them, but they also transform listeners. And I think that when you listen to these stories over and over again, you want to be a better person. You want to be a kinder person. You become more empathetic. So you are doing such a great service by sharing your story, because I do think these stories are changing the world. And I'm not exactly sure why more and more people are getting interested, but I'm certainly glad they are. And I hope that continues, because I really feel that we need it right now.
Oh, absolutely. And I think they're very empowering too. I mean, they allow people to really take ownership of who they are, their spirituality, and people could have a life that's similar to the after effect gifts of near-death experiences by listening to some of
Yes.
them. And you're living proof, or someone who worked, in mass media and journalism, and now there was the before that, and now there's the after that, where now it seems like you've taken ownership of this and stopped hiding, and now you're become public. I mean, for viewers who might be scared to come out of the quote unquote spiritual closet, and just kind of own their story, like what types of insights could you have? Because you're someone who not just thinks about it, but you have put that tire in that pavement. You've left, that world behind, and now you're owning it. So what types of insight did you have, and what did it bring to you once you started to say, hey, this is me, this is Heather, and I got to make a channel, I got to broadcast this? So I could imagine anything that we do isn't just in a solo vacuum. There has to be a ripple effect of change. So I'm wondering what, we have viewers listening now, what could you say to that?
Well, I do think it's hard for a lot of people to come out of the closet, because there's such a stigma with kind of woo-woo stuff that is out there. And I was working in a science field, so that's kind of really, doing a 180 to what I was doing. But I do find most people are very receptive to it. I also think that a lot of us were held back because we grew up with certain thoughts and beliefs, and we were really scared to question that, sometimes just because we didn't want to hurt people in our family. And they might be by us questioning things, and you get a little older and you say, I really need to be more authentic in who I am. And I've always been curious. I was curious as a kid, but as a kid, I didn't feel like I could ask these questions, because people would be, or I felt that they would say, well, don't you believe? Why are you asking these questions? But I think God is big enough for questions. And I think that it's important to ask questions, because how else are we going to know what's true and what we believe and what we can come to know? It's kind of like when I have an ailment or something, say I hurt my arm, and you go to a physical therapist and they say, well, do this exercise and this exercise. And if I come home and I don't know why I'm supposed to do it, I'll go, and I don't do it. But if I can say, well, why do I need to do this? And they can explain it to me, I'm like, okay, that makes sense to me. And I think it's the same way when it comes to what we believe in our faith. It's important to ask questions so that we feel comfortable knowing and going, okay, I get that. This makes sense to me.
So it seems for you, from asking some of those questions, you found some answers, if you will. But sometimes I think when people explore knowledge, we recognize, hey, the more that we know, the more that we recognize we don't know. So is
so
that
true.
like a delicate balance that has happened with you where, yes, there's a lot of ground that you've gained, but also through reading and hearing this stuff, it's like, wow, there's endless information. And I don't know if I'll really conceptualize this all in my lifetime. Does that happen to you in a way?
Oh, that is so true. There is so much more that we don't know than what we do know. And I think when we hear these near-death experiences, they're just a piece of the puzzle. It's like if you suddenly woke up in Arizona, you'd go, wow, these mountains are beautiful, but you would have no concept of the ocean. And when you think about how vast, just our universe is, and then you think about, there's so much we don't know just here on Earth and the universe, and God is so much bigger than that. So there's no way that we can know what we need to know or everything that is out there. So I think that's why I'm curious. I just keep exploring, and I know no matter how much I learn, there'll be a lot more that I still have to learn.
Yeah. Each and every day, right? I'm sure you're learning something new with your channel, and you're interviewing others and reading about it.
Yes.
What's the point? I always say, what's the point of entering tomorrow if there's not something different than yesterday?
That's a good point.
So that's beautiful that you're doing this. And now, like, there's a two byproduct thing where you're benefiting from it, but also the thousands of listeners who tune into Beyond with HeatherTesch are also benefiting with it. So I think that's great.
Well, and I think one thing that I bring is, because I haven't had an experience, is I probably have a lot of the same questions that they have. And, once you've had an experience, you might just take it for granted that, whereas I want to know all the details. And so those are kind of the questions that I ask when I have a guest on. So hopefully I'm asking what my audience likes to hear. And also, I always say, if you have a question, put it in the comments. And then I do take those questions and ask a future guest.
Right. Obviously the audience and the topic at hand is different, with your journalistic work. But I know you're trained in, traditional journalism. You have a degree from college as well as meteorology. Is there a difference in approach that you have, as a journalist now interviewing, the spiritual community, near-death experiencers, or do you find that that's helpful with what you do with that background, in your channel, or is it like hindering this and you have to like totally revamp your approach towards it?
No, I think it really helps. I certainly like to go in, and having done my research, and I think it's more the experience I gained over the years, just from, doing interviews on television and just talking in front of the camera. I think those skills have helped me. But, there are so many amazing people like you and so many others that are doing an amazing job that probably don't have that same background. And I think it's really a great time for people that are curious, because there are so many wonderful podcasts. And I think we all have kind of a little bit different spin. So people can really find their niche. And, if they're like me, you're going to listen to a bunch of them because you just enjoy hearing the variety.
Yeah. And all the different backgrounds that people have and their different experiences will hopefully reach people from different parts of the world, and they'll be able to find something that speaks to them. The variety is great. I know I'm sorry, you were saying.
Oh, I was just going to say, and I think too, my guests are very different. I have one guest that'll come on and they have this very strong particular faith, over here. And then somebody else comes on and they have, this over here, which is maybe out here more. And so if you listen to just one, you might think, oh, there's an agenda there. But when you listen to all of them, you do find that I really try to get a variety of experiences out there so everybody can gain and learn. And, sometimes a lot of them have common themes, but there are also ones that, they don't always match up in terms of what people have brought back from their near-death experience. And I think that's a lot because we interpret them through our human brains, which are just not capable of all of that, bringing it down here and through our mouth.
Yeah, I always say I think we come from oneness, but oneness does not mean sameness.
It's a good
And
point.
I think there's variety that will allow, maybe my story will speak to a specific type of demographic and not being able to reach that. And that's okay. Every student has another teacher that they could relate to, have rapport with, understand. But I mean, ultimately, the greatest teachers really empower students to be their own teachers, their own ambassadors of this. So hopefully when people listen, to these things, they take ownership of their spirituality and their afterlife. I think people tune into it because there's something familiar in what the near-death experiencer is discussing that hits home with them. I think we all
I
have some
agree.
degree of memory of this life beyond this body, with when we're free and unencumbered and flying around on the other side. So I think there's some degree of memory in the
We
subconscious.
we may not remember home, but we kind of feel it on the inside. And when we do listen to these stories, there's just kind of that connection, that knowing that we
Yeah.
take.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I know you mentioned ions, which I think you
Mhm.
were a participant in this past year, if I'm wrong, or maybe in the past. I know
Yes, I
I've
went
been,
this year and before. Mhm.
yeah, I mean, I know, back, a couple of years ago, I used to affiliate with, the big workshops and the annual conventions. But what was fascinating when I went to ions was how many people I spoke to who came from mass media or journalistic backgrounds, who had near-death experiences, or people who just maybe in the media field. But I just find that it was just something that stuck with me. I'm just like wondering, like, what is that about? Like, do you feel God in a way, or the universe, used there was a plan with your path and many other people in the media field to just say, hey, we're going to do this, but then we're going to apply this when you're ready, towards another gear. Is that a possibility, do you feel?
That's certainly a possibility. And, back when I first graduated from college in journalism and then in meteorology, it's not like you could just start your own podcast. It's not like there was even an audience for this or the ability to share this information. Certainly, you couldn't go to your news director and say, hey, I'd really like to talk about this. And they'd be like, get out of here. So there wasn't an opportunity then. Now, fortunately, there are lots of opportunities. And I really started to think more about it. I mean, I always was fascinated by these stories, but when I started to really think about going out on my own was around the time of COVID, because
Mm,
suddenly I was shooting a lot of my weather reports from my house because we went remote.
right,
And
right.
so, you start to go, oh, I could do this. And so that kind of got me thinking. And it really took a couple of years for me to go from thinking about it to actually doing it. And part of the reason was because there are so many talented people already doing it.
Mm,
But I did decide that I think I can bring something a little bit different, and there's room for everybody. And as more and more people get interested, it's great to have all these choices of what we can listen to.
yeah. I mean, the internet could be a powerful thing. It could unite people, it could
Mhm.
divide people, and it's just all
Yes.
how you use it. But you
Mhm.
make a point that COVID was, and the people that I speak to, was a time where people just reevaluated so much of their life, and all of a sudden,
Mhm.
subject of life and death was broadcasted expeditiously in front of so many. And I think it
True.
was a global NDE, that near-death experience that was happened, where all of a sudden you were forced to contemplate this existence, this reality. Do you feel that happened to you? And did you see like a difference with some of the people that you encountered? Or I'm just wondering if that happened to you, or others that you know of, because I found a lot of people transformed amongst the trauma that we went through collectively, and the pain, and
Right.
just the acute grief. There was also transformation on the other side of that too, the last couple of years.
Well, I certainly felt that as much tragedy there was, and there certainly was so much tragedy, there were also very positive things that came out of COVID, and I think people did start to rethink and reevaluate
Mhm.
who they are and what they're doing in their life, and I'm not sure if that played a role in it. I do know that's when I started to think about it. And I also kind of got to the point in my life where if I'm going to do this, I need to do it now because, life is short. You never know how long you have. And I think too, for a long time, it's hard when you're established in a career to give that up because, that's your bread and butter. That's how you're earning money. And to just say, I'm going to let all that go and I'm going to take my own money and invest it into something and not, it's not like it's bringing returns here right now.
Right.
Yeah, that. And so, we do it as an investment in love and just wanting to be better people, enrich the world, and share this with other people because it's important to us and we feel it can really help the world. But I just think I got to the point in my life where I did want to become more authentic in what was important to me. And so this was a way to do that.
Yeah. And Heather Tesch today versus 10 or 15 years ago, do you feel a difference from making that leap of faith?
Yeah, I think that I was more scared to come out. And I think that's because, I'd heard along the way, people would kind of roll their eyes at people that were thinking about things that were different than what we grew up in terms of our faith. And I certainly don't want to substitute one thing for another. I think, a lot of times we take what we grew up with and then we can expand upon it. And we can see that there's so much more than we ever could have learned. You think of how many books there are in the world that contain so much knowledge. And so when I've heard people say, well, if it's not in the Bible, it can't be the case. Well, how can you fit God into that? And how can you fit all of this creation into that book? I mean, it's impossible. So just for that reason alone, there's just so much more for us to learn. And you can always, if you're, afraid of, stepping outside of your faith, you can always go, hey, God, I don't really know who you are, but I want to know you. And so reveal yourself to me. And, that's a way I think you can do it by keeping that connection and not just totally stepping back from what you believed when you grew up.
Yeah. It's okay to be you. It's okay to own who you are. I mean, I know, my viewers are probably tuning in around this Thanksgiving time. We always have that, family member who might try to grill us, who might come from a lower level of awareness. But I think really it's just, not trying to sell people on this stuff and just owning it and playing it light with those types of people. Because, we're not here to change people. We're here to really change ourselves and those that we're meant to cross paths with.
That's true. And when occasionally in the comments, I'll get somebody, that says, oh, this is a bunch of BS. And that's fine. Because you know what? This is not everybody's thing. And if it's your thing, great. Listen to it. And if it's not, just you can find other entertainment somewhere else. And I'm okay with that. Because I think all of us at different phases in our life, we've been into different things. And they may evolve and be more interested over the years, or they may not. And that's perfectly fine.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think people's level of awareness has to do, with their vantage point of where they're looking at life from. We're looking at life through a higher, basis. You could understand and grasp more, and you're looking at life from more of like a limited basis. That's what you could see. And everyone is on a different level of awareness in this life. And that makes life a more diverse, beautiful experience.
Right.
And much like grade school,
And I certainly don't have the answers. I'm like many out there, I'm a seeker. And so I love hearing from people that have had near-death experiences like you, because it gives me just a little bit more information to work with. But I will never, say to somebody, oh, this is how it is, because I don't know how it is. Here are a few things I think might be the case, but, I really don't know, and I won't know until I transition someday.
Sure. Let's talk about that speculation piece that you've gathered through a lot of years of research that you said in interviews with others. Would you say your viewpoint towards the afterlife is more of a belief, a knowing, a faith? Like, what would you assess your afterlife viewpoint at this moment?
Well, I think the only people that know are the ones that have been there. I think the rest of us believe, And we can feel we know, but it's still faith until you've actually been there, done that. And so I do feel I have a strong faith. I've always had a strong faith and known, that I wanted to know more. But I think that's evolved in my thoughts about what that means.
Mm.
And I'm still exploring, and I think differently than I did 10 years ago. I think differently than I did 20 years ago. And in 10 years, I might think differently as well. But certainly there are some things that when you listen to a lot of these, and when I've done my podcast, that you learn and you go, huh, that's really interesting, because a lot of folks are talking about this. And I don't know about you, but was there anything that you found when you interviewed people that really surprised you?
I mean, what I am drawn to is a lot of evidential pieces.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what sticks to me is, when near-death experiencers could remember tennis shoes at the top of the
Yes.
hospital while being on the bed,
Mm-hmm.
totally flatlined, unless they're having, some type of helicopter going on top of the building while they're on the bed. None of that is possible.
Right.
So I think that, those kind of stories that I hear, and those are quite common, are people remembering the conversations of the medical staff.
Mm-hmm.
Those stick to me as a learner, as a viewer. Obviously I have my experience. I can only speak to what I know, but as someone who explores stuff, I think really it's about making a case of eternity and things that might stick with evidence, or things that just penetrate your heart and soul. Not obviously not having a blind faith in these things, because that could lead to manipulation and
Right.
deceit, taking advantage of. But I think we all have our own barometer on truth and reality as we know it, and I think that's a subjective matter. I think it's accumulation for most people. It might not be one
It
thing, but
is.
it builds and builds, and then maybe you hear one thing, you're like, oh my God, that put me over the top. But before that, something accumulated, my guess is.
Yes, I think it's often very gradual. And that's why, I've enjoyed listening to so many of these over the years, because you listen to one and you're like, oh, that's really interesting. But when you hear the same types of things over and over again, you learn how important love is. And you just hear that same message coming through over and over. And so, it is really interesting to hear a lot of stories. And I do think it is going to change the world, as far as just getting to know more and more of these stories, and evolving because of that, and the information that we're taking in.
Absolutely. In a way, I mean, we all experience grief on a macro,
Mhm.
micro basis. Um, I'm wondering too, and obviously the last couple of years has been a grief of the world that we had,
Mhm.
with the world that we have at the moment. Has, here near-death experiences, I'm just kind of curious, has that helped you in a way with some of the grief or loss that you might have experienced throughout your
Oh,
life? Because I know
yes.
there's a big relationship with belief and grief at times. So I'm wondering if that has helped you too.
Well, I would think near-death experiences would help a lot of people,
Mm.
because they remind us, they reinforce that there's so much more. And I've talked to a lot of people that have faith, they grew up with faith, but they still love that confirmation of somebody coming back and saying, hey, it's real. There is much more to that. And so I do think it's comforting for those of us that have lost someone that we love. And for many people, that's even a pet. And I found that's really reassuring when people say, oh, yeah, you're going to see your pets again. And, I believe I will.
Have you ever felt, like a presence around you or a pet around you, or have you had
Mhm.
any signs,
I
from
have.
loved ones that you've had in your life? Yeah.
I have. I had a cat that was ill, and so I took him to the vet, and he said, "Well, you're going to need to tube feed him for 6 to 8 weeks." And I don't remember if it was his liver or kidney, something had to heal. And so then at 6 to 8 weeks, we take the feeding tube out. Well, he never got better. So for a year and a half, 2 years, I tube fed that cat. So the only way he was surviving was by me feeding him. And it was actually a huge chore, because there's this pressure difference between your stomach. And if you don't get it right, it literally could score it on the ceiling.
Right.
And so he's the only animal that ever came back to me.
Mm.
But when he died, I was sleeping, But then I had this vision and it was so clear, and it was him, and he was, looking at me, and he didn't say anything. He just smiled, and I knew he was saying thank you.
Wow.
So that's my one experience with a life that was on the other side that I had a connection with. Now, there may be other little things that, I felt there were times in my life when I kind of needed some reassurance. And there was a point in my life when I would get pennies. I mean, I would find several a day, every day. And now I don't. But at that time, I really needed that. Was that from God? Was it from angels? Was it from my dad who passed when I was 18?
Mm.
So I do think there are signs out there that we just have to watch for, and not everything's a sign. Sometimes I think people can fool themselves, but I think they're certainly out there.
Yeah. Well, that was a beautiful connection that you had with your cat, and certainly getting the pennies. And you're right. I think we'd have to look out for them. Don't try to force them. Sometimes if we do, it's like, how come I'm not seeing it? I'm not seeing it.
They don't show up.
It's kind of like this gentle tap on your shoulder. Like, I know when I'm driving, like if I'm just on, like I'm aware, but I'm not trying to force it. Like, things will just kind of come very gently.
Yes.
And I know when my grandmother died that night, I opened up my phone when I was driving home when I found out that she passed. And on my Spotify, the playlist came that said Grandma's Home.
Aww.
I've never seen that in my 33 years of life. At the time, 31, 32, I was when my grandma passed. But stuff like that, the probability and statistics of that happening in that moment,
right?
You can't. It's 0.000 nothing. Like, it never happened to me once in my life. So open up my phone, Spotify, boom, and those are just one of the many of thousands and millions of examples that people have. Where if you look at the probability and statistics of you seeing that sign at that moment, it's zero. So you have to kind of question the little things. Yeah.
And with near-death experiences too, you were talking earlier about, the evidence that there's so many of them that do have some sort of proof. And I always find it fascinating when people say, well, there's no evidence, because I do think that there is evidence out there. It may not be the typical scientific evidence where you can do a study and find it, but there are bits and pieces. And then other people, say, there's no proof. And another way to look at that is, well, there's so many things that we don't know yet. That doesn't mean they don't exist. And that's with science all the time. They're discovering things. And so I think we have to be open-minded, that you can't just disbelieve something just because you can't prove it in a certain scientific way.
That's beautiful. Just because you don't see it or know it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And I love that. I start off of almost every one of my talks with this great analogy of two people on the shoreline. One person is in a boat, they're very far away, and the person looks at the other man and he's like, well, that person is over the shoreline. I don't see them. They're off the horizon. They're no longer here. And the other person just turns and says, just because you don't see them does not mean that ship isn't just as strong and powerful as it was before. So just because you don't see things with their physical eyes doesn't mean that they're not still there, as strong and beautiful as you knew them. So I think that's so true. I wanted to ask you, because I also read and heard that and I know you're mentioning your cat, that you're a very big animal lover. That's something big to you. Tell me a little bit about, that work, and I think that's pivotal in today's times, because animals offer that unconditional love and support. We could be doing whatever and they'll still love us. But what have they meant to you? What kind of work have you done really with that? Yeah.
Well, it's kind of like too, when, people have asked me, how long have you been interested in these spiritual things? And it's kind of the same way when people ask me, like, well, when did you start getting fascinated with cats, or when did you love them? And it's like, I always have, I've always just had this attraction. But I also think that when I was a kid and when I was sad, I could just sit there and hold my cat. And it was a comfort when you don't have somebody else to turn to, or you just not, you don't want to turn to somebody else. You just want to keep it to yourself. It's great. And, I had that throughout my childhood. I'm so glad that we had pet cats. And I've just always been an advocate for them. I get people like different breeds of dogs and cats, but I always encourage people There are so many animals in the shelter. So, if you want to adopt, it's such a great place to do it. I also feel that animals are a lifetime commitment, so don't do it if you don't plan to keep them.
Mm.
And I have a lot of cats. I have too many cats. I have 5, plus my daughter lives with me now, and she's got 1. So we have 6 cats in the house. And I always say I would not have 6 cats if every cat had a home, but they don't. And so 2 of my most recent ones, my daughter found a feral cat that was pregnant. And so she trapped it, and then we brought it to her house, and the cat was not happy. But we put it in our laundry room, which had a lot of light and windows. And so she had her kittens. She had 7 kittens, and we found homes for 6 of them. And I couldn't find a home for her because, she was feral and she was an adult and people were disinterested. But I ended up keeping her and one of her kittens. And even though I can't touch her, I can't pick her up. I can pet her and she'll come up to me and she's super sweet. And I can tell she's so grateful. But, she still has some of those feral instincts in her, but it really feels good because I know she's just so happy. You can just tell she's like, oh, I've got a home, I've got food, life is good. So, I feel, that's my thing. We all have different causes. Somebody else, it might be, they want to help the homeless community or they want to help children in another country. And I think it's great that there's a variety of things. We don't all have to have the same interests, but when we do, it's nice if we can help out where we can.
That's beautiful. I love that you live your truth and own your passions. And I heard someone said that animals are just angels with 4 legs or wings or whatever, our pets that we have, they really are. Because when you experience a dog or a cat that you love, there is nothing like it. And
yes,
it seems like there's almost some symbology or allegory with your life where you're bringing so many people to come home, whether that's viewers on YouTube or cats come into your home. It's really about the home and having people feel comfortable and safe, to be home and talking about the other side, the ultimate home. So I think that's beautiful. My last question for you, Heather, is obviously you have a podcast, which is great. Beyond with Heather Tesch. So people could find you through YouTube as well. Do you have a website, additionally?
My son is sort of building me a website, but he kind of got halfway through it. So I don't really have a working website right now, but certainly YouTube, Beyond with Heather Tesch. You can find me there. Also, if you're into social media, you can find me on Facebook, Beyond with Heather Tesch. I'm on TikTok, same name.
Instagram as well too, right?
Yeah. And, but really the main channel is YouTube, and that's where you can find all of my videos and all my wonderful guests like you that are on there. And there really has been some fascinating, everybody's been so fascinating to talk to. I've learned so much.
Well, you're doing so much in so little time since you started it. I'm wondering what's next in the pipeline, but maybe that's brewing, but maybe a book or who knows. Yeah.
It's keeping me busy, as you know, because you have a podcast of your own. There's a lot of work that goes into it. And then also when I do the social media, there's a lot of work that goes into that. And I do that to help promote the channel and let people know that it's out there, because I don't know if you found this, but that's the hardest thing, is letting people know that it's available to them. And if it's their thing, great, they can know it's there. If it's not their thing, that's fine. But I think sometimes we just don't know where to look. And so I do hope that people can find podcasts like yours and podcasts like mine if that's what they're interested in.
Beautiful. So viewers, do check out Beyond with Heather Tesch. It's a wonderful podcast.
Thank you.
Last 2 questions before you go, because I know you have a lot to do, Heather. If you were to speak to yourself, I try to ask this to some, I guess, but if you were to speak to yourself 15 to 20 years, or maybe your inner child, what would you say to that person? And also, is there any other last messages that you have? Because I know we're coming up on the new year, 2024, here we come. But any last messages that come to your mind, or messages in general to close, our conversation? We'd obviously love to have you come back whenever you can. But
thank you.
Any things that is really, kind of like chewing at you right now, or just kind of like wood kind of burning in your mind right now?
Right. Well, I think that I would probably tell myself what probably a lot of us should tell ourselves, and that is to have confidence. It's all going to be okay.
Mm.
Because I think that's the biggest thing that I've lacked all along my journey is just believing in myself. And as you've said, and you said it on my podcast, how important self-love is. And that's a hard thing for a lot of us. And it's something I still am working on. So I would definitely tell myself to be more confident. I'd say, hey, it all works out. It's going to be great. Don't worry about it. Because I, like many of you, have had challenging times in my life where you're like, oh my gosh, and you don't think it's going to get better, but it does. I've always said that life and even marriage, I mean, it's kind of like this. If you hang on in the downtime, it's going to come back up. And it's really with jobs, everything in life, that it usually swings. And certainly there are cases when it doesn't. And I don't want to in any way, diminish that. But I think for most of us is we just need to just know all is well. That's the message from so many near-death experiencers. And as far as, all the ones that I've listened to, and the biggest takeaway is the importance of love. And one of the reasons I started my channel was not just for near-death experiences, but I also wanted to get across that message of being kinder and more empathetic toward others. Because everybody's struggling. Everybody, is going through things. And even if somebody has a completely different view than you do on something, that doesn't mean they're a bad person. It just means that their life circumstances took them to believe this, and your life circumstances brought you to this place. And so I think we have to stop demonizing people and really look at people with love and kindness. And if we did that, just imagine how the world would change. It would just be an amazing place to live. And we can get there. And I think these stories of yours and other near-death experiencers are one way we're going to get there.
Beautiful, beautiful. My final question, I promise, and I can't believe I didn't ask this earlier.
Yes.
I know in my talks and a lot of other talks, people use nature or weather as like metaphors and allegories. I could be totally going on a limb here, and there's nothing to do with each other. But being a Weather Channel meteorologist, do you notice any symbology or references with weather, meteorology, and spiritual flow? Maybe there's nothing to it. I could be totally off, but is there any type of parallel? Because I'm sure there's got to be something there that you
Well,
have.
it's something I've never thought about. So thank you for asking. It's a difficult question to answer, though. But certainly when I think of love, I think of light. You think of the sun. And there are challenging times. You have the clouds out there. You have the storms in life. But the storms are not all bad. They sometimes feel horrible, but they're bringing rain. They're improving the conditions. So you need that. And I think some of our most challenging times are where we grow the most and how we become better people. And that's also how we learn to empathize, because when we've gone through a lot of stuff, you have more empathy for somebody else in their suffering. And if life was easy and good and it was always the sunshine, how would we understand when other people suffer? So, there are certainly small things like that. But in the end, it's probably all good. Well, maybe not a tornado, but, again, that brings out too, you see, when there were hurricanes and tornadoes and they would be so destructive, you saw the best in humanity and you saw people reaching out. And so it's in here, it's in here. It's just that we sometimes forget who we are and we get angry and frustrated. And if somebody doesn't agree with us or believe what we believe, but on the inside, I think we're all, we have that love, and we just have to work more, or maybe not work, maybe just let it out, but just, really try to bring that love forward, the sunlight into this world.
Beautiful, beautiful. I know one of my colleagues who taught Michael Jordan and Kobe Bryant meditation, mindfulness.
Nice.
His name is George Mumford. He always speaks of the eye of the hurricane, like the calm in the storm, and find that point of brilliance and wisdom and guidance. And so not all storms, if we're, on the outside of it, we'll get swept up in it. We come to that place of connectivity.
And why do, I'm sorry, I was going to say, why do we have hurricanes? Because we're balancing out, the weather on the earth, so they have a purpose, even though they can be destructive.
Beautiful, Beautiful. Well, Heather Tesch, thank you for sharing so much of your wisdom from your transformation and now at the end, crossbreeding the professional and spiritual outlook. I don't think that was random. And I think there needs to be more references to nature and spirituality. They're very much intertwined and just about going with the flow. So thank you very much. And thank you, my viewers, for tuning in. And Heather Tesch, come back, anytime that you want to on my channel, and keep up the courageous and beautiful work that you're doing each day. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jacob. I so appreciate being on your channel. I so appreciate you coming on mine, and you keep up the good work, because it's your stories that are changing the world and changing lives.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful conversation with Heather Tesch. I just love the courageousness that she has in her capacity to take a leap of faith and leave, an old life behind in traditional media and working in the Weather Channel, to now she's, involved in conscious media, and journalism with her own podcast. So make sure you subscribe and check out her channel, Beyond with Heather Tesch, where you'll see my interview coming up, as well as many others. So thank you all for tuning in. Have a wonderful rest of your holiday week. To all my seekers who are tuning in, we'll see you next week, and we'll continually climb the ladder, the endless ladder of wisdom, awareness, and consciousness together each and every week here on the Wisdom Jacob's Ladder. All love to my viewers. Thank you.